Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to SMU, to the Hilltop, and to Dedman College, and of course to the Center for Presidential History. My name is Jeffrey Engel, and I, of course, have the honor of being your host this evening, which means I have the honor of introducing you to this wonderful speaker and this wonderful partnership that we have tonight, which I will explain in just a few minutes. But before going into this evening, let me give our typical thanks first to our good friends at the Bush Library with whom we partner with on this series. Also, I'd like to thank the Office of the Provost, Steve Carell, for all their support in making everything that we do possible, and also the Dean of Dedman College, Tom DiPiero. Now tonight, we are particularly thrilled because this is part of a partnership with the Dallas Theater Center. If you've not yet become aware, you now will, that there is a wonderful play, LBJ's All the Way, which is being played this month, and actually just extended for another 2 weeks. We have been doing a series of partnerships with them and other history groups around the city, including our good friends at the Sixth Floor Museum. We've done some explorations of LBJ's politics, his life and times, his evolution and transition from, of course, John Kennedy in an instant. And we've also been partnering with the good folks at the Dallas Theater Center, not only on this evening's event, but also on tomorrow night's event. At their center, we're having the Center for Presidential History Night at the DTC. And our speaker this evening will be doing the after talk following the performance. Now, if you have not seen this performance, go. You really should. There are still seats available, and of course tomorrow night is our night. Now in that spirit, let me actually do something unusual for us today, which is to start with a slide. This is, obviously, Martin Luther King, and speaking exactly, and I kid you not, we could not make this stuff up, exactly 50 years ago today at SMU. Yes, I planned that. Okay. So, I want you to think back, if you will, to 50 years ago, to 1966. Most of the major legislation of the Great Society has been passed, but not yet implemented. I'm speaking, of course, about Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights, voting rights. We are also 2 years following the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and a year after Lyndon Johnson's fateful decision to Americanize the war in Vietnam. At this moment, when Martin Luther King is speaking here at SMU, there are at that point 366,000 American troops in theater and in combat in Vietnam. 366,000. Now to put this into context, the recent war that we endured and fought in Iraq, the height of American deployment was 166,000. So more than 2.5 times as many by the end of the Vietnam War. That is, 500,000 troops were deployed. And of course, as you know, 50,000 of them did not come home. And in the midst of all this, Martin Luther King came to SMU. A man who is a feature of the play, with which we are here to discuss in part, and also a man whose words helped define an entire era and an entire movement. And in fact, what's truly impressive is that the movement began and evolved largely through his words. And it's in that spirit of moving politics and society forward with words, that I'm particularly pleased to announce tonight a new endeavor that we are putting forward from our center in conjunction with the Carrie McGuire Center for Ethics and Policy, along with their director, Rita Kirk, who is somewhere in the audience, I think. If you are here, wave. And that is what we're calling our Third Rail series. Now, if you're not familiar with the term third rail, first of all, that means you haven't spent nearly enough time around subways. But a third rail in American politics is something which, as you know, if you touch it as a politician, you will die. It is an issue like Social Security. Touch it at your own peril. But we have decided that you may have noticed in American politics today, there seems to be a tad bit lack of civility going on. And we thought that if there's anything particularly important about a university, it is this. It is as a place that people can come and discuss important, uncomfortable, dare we say even problematic and dangerous issues, but discuss them civilly and discuss them in a penetrating fashion without violence, without discord, and hopefully with insight. So therefore, we are teaming up to create a new series. And we decided the best way to approach this is to conduct it as if we were at Oxford or Cambridge as part of a debating society, so that we will have a resolution. One person on the stage will, of course, endorse the resolution, another person will argue the negative, and then you, as the audience, will not only get to participate, but subsequently get to vote on the resolution. Now, before I show you our first resolution, I want to point out to you that the whole purpose here is to engage difficult topics. Resolved, the 2016 campaign has produced unusual vitriol, anger, and political extremism, of which political correctness is to blame. You need not agree with that. In fact, if you all agreed with that, there'd be no point to having this resolution. But we think it's a good place to start a conversation. So please watch your email and watch your electronic media and our Facebook page and all that good stuff to find out more details on when this first in this series begins. But now, let us turn away from the politics of today to the politics of the 1960s that we are here to discuss. For tonight, we are, of course, here to discuss Lyndon Johnson, a Texan, a president, and perhaps arguably the most transformative president since his idol, Franklin Roosevelt, a president who took power in tragedy, yet in time took the nation in his own direction, with benefits and consequences that I think are still being felt today. And there is no one in the country, I think, better to speak to that legacy than Professor Julian Zelizer of Princeton University. He is, to my mind, a leading historian of American politics at work today. In fact, I'd even go so far to say is that no one has done as much to transform, and one might even say resuscitate, the study of American politics as Professor Zelizer. A graduate of Brandeis and Johns Hopkins, he has authored or edited 13 books on American politics. Now, I have to say that's the last time I checked. Is it still 13? No, it's not. It's more. Okay. Amazon is not updating fast enough for Julian. He has described the rise of the conservative movement, the evolution of American taxation, and that most befuddling of American institutions, the United States Congress. He's a frequent news commentator and columnist, and he is here to discuss Lyndon Johnson, and in particular from this book, The Fierce Urgency of Now, which of course you can get your own copy in the lobby afterwards. And let me tell you, if you want to read one book about this period, this is it. So please, if you would, join me in welcoming Professor Zelizer.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Jeff, for that very nice introduction, and thanks for having me here. It's terrific to be on campus and to see all the wonderful events and speakers that you have here, and I look forward to those of you who will come to the play tomorrow. It'll be a different discussion after the play, don't worry. It's a great play, so I'm actually looking forward to talking about politics and theater and how they put this together. At 4 a.m. on November 23rd, 1963, just hours after President Kennedy's tragic assassination right here in Dallas, President Lyndon Johnson was reclining on his bed, where he often liked to have many meetings with his advisors, and Lady Bird was familiar with this and comfortable with this and would turn around and go back to sleep. But that night, he held a meeting with a group to think about what his vision was going to be as president. He told Jack Valenti, Bill Moyers, and Cliff Carter, who were all huddled around him, with relish and resolve, Valenti recalled. He said, "I'm going to get Kennedy's tax bill out of the Senate Finance Committee, and we're going to get this economy humming again. Then I'm going to pass Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill, which has been hung up too long in Congress. And I'm going to pass it without changing a single word or comma. After that, we'll pass legislation that allows anyone, anywhere in this country to vote with all the barriers down. And that's not all," he said. "We're going to get a law that says every boy and girl in this country, no matter how poor or the color of their skin or the region they come from, will be able to get all the education that they can take by loan, scholarship, or grant right from the federal government." And pausing almost to catch his breath from his own ambitions, he concluded by saying, "And I'm going to pass Harry Truman's medical insurance bill that got nowhere before." Jack Valenti's recollection of that moment perfectly portrays the Lyndon Johnson the frenetic energy of the person who suddenly, through tragedy, had become the nation's leader. Johnson was a creature of Congress. He had spent most of his life on Capitol Hill. He believed that legislation was the mark of a great president, and from the very beginning, he was determined to pass a transformative agenda on Capitol Hill, nothing less than a second New Deal. And what's remarkable is how much did actually pass during those years, just between 1964 and 66, which is really the height of most of the Great Society. The nation sees a huge number of laws passed through Congress: Medicare and Medicaid, Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, federal aid to education, federal aid to higher education, immigration reform, food stamps, and much, much more. And what's remarkable isn't just the volume of legislation that passes during those years, which today seems almost impossible, but also how much of it has lasted. Much of the Great Society has endured even through the age of Reagan, even through a very conservative era of American politics. One of the stories that I like to talk about, which many of you will remember, took place when President Obama was pushing for his health care bill. And there were some protesters, conservatives, Tea Party protesters, who held up signs during some of the protests saying, "Get your government hands off my Medicare." And the sign was a reference to cuts that would take place in Medicare savings as part of the package. And the sign was ironic, the sign was funny, but the sign was also very significant, because I think part of what it reflected was just how ingrained so many of these programs have become in American life, to the point that many conservatives also assume that this is part of the status quo in 2015 and 2016. So part of what interested me in writing the story of the Great Society, a narrative of Lyndon Johnson, was how did this happen? Writing this from the perspective of 2009 and 2010, it seems very difficult to understand how this would work. And there's two explanations people often use to tell us kind of why we had this moment. One is this was a liberal era in American politics. The ideas, the values, the ethics of liberalism were very strong in the 1960s, historians argued. This was in some ways the heyday, the last gasp of American liberalism before we entered into a new era. So passing legislation was pretty easy. It grew directly out of the body politic, and there was just very strong support for legislation that would expand what American government did in our lives. And the second explanation is less about America and more about Lyndon Johnson. And this is an argument that has also become popular in recent years, and it was that Lyndon Johnson was a legislative and political wizard unlike anything we've seen in the White House. By sheer force of will and through his immense knowledge of parliamentary procedure, Lyndon Johnson knew how to make the system work in a way that most other presidents have not. The most iconic image of Lyndon Johnson, many of you, I'm sure, have seen. You can Google it. You'll see it in the play tomorrow night. The production is the same as the one in New York, was The Treatment. And this is where Lyndon Johnson, with a pretty hulking frame, would literally hover over his opponents and his supporters on Capitol Hill or in the White House and stand over them and lobby them and try to get them to say that they will support a particular piece of legislation. And he wouldn't get out of their physical space until they said yes. And you can see pictures of him and Richard Russell, who was the Senate leader at the time for the Democrats, Theodore Green and others, kind of looking up and standing at this rather awesome figure. And it's interesting that for many, many years, decades, this wasn't how we talked about Lyndon Johnson. This is kind of part of a revival that's taken place. Johnson was primarily discussed in terms of Vietnam. including treated as a rather disastrous president. And recently there's been this revival, and often our current presidents, including President Obama, are compared to him, meaning why isn't he more like Lyndon Johnson? Why can't he wheel and deal? Why can't he understand how to get things done? And while my book tells many great stories about Lyndon Johnson's real immense skills, I want to argue that those arguments aren't really enough to understand 1960s America and why Washington produced everything that it did. And there's two reasons, and I'll get into the story. One is America wasn't as liberal as we remembered. While it's true, liberals had a prominent place in America's society, if you turn your attention from the White House to Capitol Hill, Washington looked like a very different city. During the 1950s and 60s, Congress was controlled by a conservative coalition of Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans who, since the late 1930s, had worked very hard to prevent most national programs from passing. This coalition had blocked all sorts of legislation, including civil rights, including Medicare, including federal aid to education and federal assistance to the cities. If you read books or op-eds or popular accounts of Congress in the early 1960s, right when Johnson is becoming president, it will sound a lot like today. Most of the writing was about the broken branch of government. Joseph Clark, a liberal from Pennsylvania, wrote a book in which he said that his colleagues were the sapless branch of government. A famous political scientist, James McGregor Burns, wrote a book that got a lot of attention and was reviewed everywhere in the 63. It wasn't an academic book. It was called The Deadlock of Democracy. And it was all about the tension between this conservative coalition and the ambitions of liberal Democrats who couldn't really get anywhere with their agenda. The month after John F. Kennedy is assassinated, Life magazine has their feature story written by the editors called The Lethargic Congress versus LBJ. And the whole point of the article was, could LBJ even break through this coalition, which really had little interest in moving forward with big legislation? And my book talks about the characters who really dominated Capitol Hill, many of whom are forgotten today. There was James Eastland from Mississippi, who was a powerful player on the Senate Judiciary Committee, who used to joke that he had special pockets put into his pants just where he could stuff all the civil rights bills that he would never allow for a vote. There was Howard Smith, the chairman of the House Rules Committee, who grew up on a plantation in Virginia and worked very hard to make sure that Kennedy's bills could never receive favorable attention. During the 1950s, there was one instance when civil rights was being debated where Howard Smith flew back to Virginia. He said his barn had caught on fire, so he couldn't be present, and the bill wasn't voted on. And Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, right here from Texas, said he was so angry because he understood Howard Smith would do almost anything to stop civil rights from passing, but he didn't realize he'd resort to arson if he needed to. The second argument about why this all happens in the 1960s, about Lyndon Johnson, I think sometimes puts too much emphasis on Johnson and not on the context in which he governed. Lyndon Johnson was brilliant. He was incredibly skillful. He had the ability to understand politics in a way many presidents do, but sometimes we overstate his power in ways he probably wouldn't always feel comfortable doing. If there was one thing Lyndon Johnson understood when he entered the White House, it was the limits of presidential power. This was something he had seen during his years in the House and the Senate. This was something he understood very well. Power, the only power I've got is nuclear, Johnson used to say, and I can't even use that. And Johnson was familiar with this because as Senate Majority Leader, he had watched closely as this conservative coalition had given the presidents, including Dwight Eisenhower, so much trouble. So when Johnson becomes president, he's very intent on moving fast and quickly because he tells his advisors that this window of opportunity that he has is going to close. Congress gets the best of every president, Johnson used to say to his advisors, and it's going to get the best of me at some point. My book is a narrative history of the Great Society with an eye on the tensions and the interplay between the president and Congress and social movements of the period. The book moves from John F. Kennedy's presidency, when Congress is totally gridlocked and almost all of Kennedy's domestic agenda is stuck in committee. It moves to the years between 64 and 66, when you have this moment of flourishing domestic policy that takes place, and then it ends with the years, the turbulent years, between 1966 and 68, when a racial backlash, tension over Vietnam, and tension over the budget closes the window for Lyndon Johnson, and we see how Johnson, even the great politician, couldn't get nearly as much done and spent most of his time fighting to protect what he had built. So I want to tell a few stories from the book and kind of give you a feel for some of the aspects of the 1960s that interested me. The first part of his presidency, the breakthrough, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is really the big piece of legislation. It's a legislation that he understands the president is much needed in American society, and arguably it's one of his most lasting accomplishments. And in telling the story of how did the Civil Rights Act of 64 pass, I have lots of little parliamentary fights and tricky maneuvers by Lyndon Johnson. I capture his relationship and how he courted senators like Everett Dirksen, the Senate Minority Leader of Illinois, who is known as the Senator of Ooze because of how long and dramatically he'd like to speak on the floor of the Senate. But I also try to stress the importance of the civil rights movement, broadly defined, in creating a Congress, in creating an environment where holding back on this legislation was virtually impossible. The movement worked at the grassroots level in ways that we're all more familiar with. The protests that were conducted in cities such as Birmingham were absolutely essential to changing not only public opinion, but opinion on Capitol Hill, where voting against civil rights gradually became more difficult. The civil rights movement was very strategic in how they conducted protests. When the Senate has the Civil Rights Bill in April of 1964, civil rights activists go to Illinois, and they have protests staged in Chicago, and they also threaten to have protests at the home of Everett Dirksen, simply to shine light if he was unwilling to move forward with the bill. The televised encounters, the newspaper reports about what was going on really created an atmosphere that gave liberals a lot of strength on Capitol Hill. The civil rights movement was also really effective as a force of lobbying. We forget this. It wasn't simply grassroots protests, but when the Senate takes up the Civil Rights Bill and the Southerners start to filibuster, Johnson relies on the movement to make sure the Southerners don't kill this bill, which he's not certain he'll be able to do. And I talk in the book about parts of the civil rights movement we forget about. Religious leaders, for example, and religious organizations were extremely important to this part of the fight for civil rights. Why is this the case? Because to end the filibuster against civil rights, the administration needed the support of Midwestern Republicans. They were going to be the determining vote to make sure that civil rights came up for a vote. And many Midwestern Republicans didn't care that much about the African American protesters who had really rocked the South. But religious leaders, on the other hand, had a very big impact in their states. So religious figures within the civil rights movement were incredibly important in April and May of 1964. In Iowa, I learned that the National Jewish Organization, B'nai B'rith, convened a meeting of local Christian leaders with Senator Burke Hickenlooper, who is an arch conservative who had no love for government And in this meeting, they persuade him to vote for cloture, to vote to end the civil rights filibuster. The secret of passing this bill is the religious groups, Hubert Humphrey said, who is managing the bill on the Senate floor. Just wait until these senators start hearing from the church people. And they did. National organizations coordinated sermons where local pastors would talk about the need to let this bill come up for a vote and be passed. And they urged their congregants to write their senators to do this right after the service ended. There was a phone call to South Dakota Republican Carl Munt from a priest and a bishop, one of whom had been a high school friend of his, and they persuade him in this call that it's not right to hold up a vote on civil rights. I hope that satisfied those two, pardon my language, goddamn bishops who called me last night, Munt said when he announced that he was going to support an end to the filibuster. Religious groups of all denominations went in April of '64 and conducted a 24-hour vigil at the Lincoln Memorial where they'd sleep in cots and take shifts. And the media covered this, and it was very important, again, at building support on the Hill. The civil rights movement, again, broadly defined to include organized labor, religious groups, and the civil rights organizations we're familiar with, were very important as a real organizational force. Part of the fear that the White House has is that the Southerners, as they always did, were going to find ways, procedural tricks, to prevent this bill from passing. So liberals thought that organization was going to be essential to success. There was a group in the House called the Democratic Study Group, for example, and they were very big on simply distributing information to members of the House and Senate about what was going on, what were the tactics that their opponents were using, when would there be votes so that they didn't miss them. But the story I tell in the book, which I find it's small but very revealing of how this worked, took place on April 13th, 1964. The Senate filibuster had started, but that was also the opening day of the Washington Senators baseball season, and they were playing the LA Angels. And Johnson was in attendance, as had become a ceremony, to throw out the first pitch. After he threw out the first pitch, he went into the stands, and he sat with a large group of senators from both parties, as well as the Speaker of the House, John McCormack, at that time, and they had popcorn, they drank beer. There's a picture of this in the book I was able to track down. And a lot of the senators went because they thought there had been an agreement that there wouldn't be any quorum calls that day on civil rights. When there was a quorum call, it meant that the Northerners had to go back to the Senate and there had to be a sufficient number there, or basically, this is technical, but the day would start again. The legislative day would start again. And that meant the Southerners who got tired filibustering would replenish themselves and they could all have another turn speaking. So they had made an informal deal, Hubert Humphrey, with the leaders of the filibuster that it's opening day. So some things take precedent or priority. So they're there watching the game, and then between the third and fourth inning, all of a sudden, on the speaker, the announcer, instead of telling us who had a hit, who had an error, say, all U.S. senators are requested to return to the chamber immediately. Hubert Humphrey instantly gets up, and he was said to just wave his hands in anger, realizing exactly what was going on, and he started to walk out of the stadium, and all the other senators followed, except one. And that was Richard Russell of Georgia, who was organizing the filibuster and who had arranged for this to happen just to get under their skin. But when Humphrey and his colleagues left the chamber, what was equally relevant to this story is there were a line of cars really right there waiting to get them. The Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which was the umbrella organization of the civil rights movement, knew this was going to happen. They got word, and they had cars there ready to go. They got Humphrey and his colleagues back to the Hill in about 9 minutes. Humphrey was said to walk into the chamber of the Senate, waved his hands this time proudly, and say, "We have returned." And the filibuster continued. Civil rights organizations also had something called gallery vultures. So in the gallery of the House and Senate, this is before C-SPAN, they would have people sitting there and monitoring all the discussions and deals that were going on and report what was going on to their members and to the White House to make sure that nothing happened. So these are the kinds of aspects of the civil rights movement I think are really important to understanding why by the summer of 1964 Johnson is able to find support for a bill. The next story I want to talk about is the impact of the election of 1964. It's kind of obvious, it's self-evident how important big elections can be in American politics, but it's often forgotten when we try to understand why the Great Society happened. The 1964 election was a watershed election. It has a huge impact on the tone of the House and the Senate and the public more broadly. As a result of the election where Johnson faces off against Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, Democrats exit the election with 295 seats in the House and 68 seats in the Senate, which is a filibuster-proof Senate at the time. And just as importantly, the balance between Northern and Southern Democrats in both chambers tilts decisively toward the Northerners, toward the liberals. So after the election of 1964, Johnson's looking at a Congress that is not only capable of passing a lot of bills, but they're going to do it whether he wants to or not. They're ready to go. And a lot of the leaders of the Democratic Party are eager to finish work on ideas they have been debating for over 2 decades now, including when Johnson was the majority leader. The election was also very important in that for a while, for a few years, it discredited conservatism among many Republicans. Barry Goldwater, for those of you who remember the election and have studied it, ran as a conservative Republican, and he had argued that his party couldn't always be in the center. He had argued that people like Nelson Rockefeller were a disaster to the party, and that in fact the Republicans had to embrace the ideas of conservatism. And Lyndon Johnson ran a campaign in '64 that played on that. He played on the idea that Goldwater was too extreme, that he was a danger to the country. And there were all kinds of famous ads to make this point very clear. There was the famous Daisy ad, where a little girl is seen counting petals on a flower. 1, 2, 3, as she picks them up, picks them off, and all of a sudden you hear another voice counting down, a more formal voice, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, until a nuclear mushroom can be seen, a nuclear cloud can be seen in her eyeball with the warning that Goldwater will get us into war. There's another ad that played, less known, although it's come up in the last few weeks, where there are images of the KKK. And the announcer talks about the Grand Wizard of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan having endorsed Barry Goldwater and saying that his candidacy would represent this kind of extremism. And so this had become a theme. And when Goldwater is utterly defeated and Congress has these huge liberal majorities, many Republicans in early '65 don't want to be associated with obstruction. They don't want to be associated with the far right. So Republicans on the Hill, many of them, are willing to sign on or at least offer alternatives to what Johnson is proposing. This is hugely important, understanding those years. So one person who gives us a kind of look into the effect the election had is Wilbur Mills. Before a scandal many of you, I'm sure, are thinking of involving an Argentinian stripper and the tidal basin, Wilbur Mills was one of the most powerful members of Congress. He was from Arkansas, the 2nd District. He was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, also a very effective legislator, very smart Harvard Law graduate, and had a really good understanding of how politics worked. Since the moment that John F. Kennedy had proposed Medicare several years earlier, Wilbur Mills had never allowed Medicare to come up for a vote. He had been one of these Southern Committee chairs who said, this isn't going to happen. And there wasn't much in that era that a president could do. President Kennedy, when he was elected, said, I have to listen to Wilbur Mills. He was chair of the Ways and Means before I was president. He's chair while I'm president, and he's going to be chair when I'm no longer president. And when Medicare was proposed, there was a lot of opposition to it. The AMA conducted a fierce campaign to stop Medicare, which was hospital insurance for people over 65. This was the proposal, paid for through Social Security taxes. They called the program socialized medicine. They hung posters in the offices of physicians. So when a patient left, they saw a poster that said, next time you come in, a government bureaucrat is going to decide what you should be doing and what medicine you should be taking rather than your doctor. Ronald Reagan recorded a record about Medicare that warned this was the opening wedge to socialized government here in the United States, and the wives of physicians in the AMA would hold coffee klatches, and they'd play this record in the evening to try to build support in their local communities against the bill. And the other concern had been it would cost too much. And Wilbur Mills believed both of these arguments were true, and in 1962, he didn't let the bill come up for a vote. In 1963, he wouldn't let the bill come up for a vote. And in 1964, after John F. Kennedy had been assassinated, and when Johnson made a full-scale push to get this through Congress before the election of '64, Mills didn't care. He wouldn't let it come up for a vote, and he stifled the bill in committee once again. After the election of '64, everything changed. Wilbur Mills understood that most Democrats were not going to stand for obstruction anymore. Many of the new Democrats elected to Congress had run on a pro-Medicare platform. Many of the ads about Barry Goldwater had focused on his opposition to Medicare and to Social Security. There was a famous ad where you see two hands ripping up a Social Security card. That was quite devastating. And Republicans in January and February of '65, rather than obstructing Medicare, said, we're going to propose our own versions of health care for the aged. So by February of 1965, the administration once again asked Congress to pass Medicare. A Republican named John Burns from Wisconsin, who was on the Ways and Means Committee, he proposes a different idea. He says the government should pay for the doctor's costs, not the hospital costs, and it'll be paid for through a combination of government money and a premium that everyone who participated in the program would pay. And there was a third proposal, also from Republicans, that the government would provide health care for those who were medically indigent, people who could not afford health care, a kind of welfare health care program for the aged. In March 1965, in a closed committee meeting, the Ways and Means Committee meets to discuss all these bills. The administration doesn't really know what's going to happen. Wilbur Mills sits back, and the guy who had been the chief obstructionist to Medicare says, why don't we take all three bills and make them one grandiose program? And that's exactly what happened. Medicare A, which covers hospital costs, Medicare B, which covers doctor costs, and Medicaid, which is that third program. Johnson was stunned when Wilbur Cohen, one of his assistants, calls him up and actually explains to him what Congress had just done. And Wilbur Mills transforms himself from being the chief opponent of Medicare to the architect of a health care program that no one had envisioned. But the election is absolutely essential to understanding how Mills ends up moving, how he ends up supporting this for fear that he will be left out and humiliated if he says no after that election. And finally, I'll talk about a housing bill that Johnson proposes in 1966, which gives us a flavor for how the environment of Washington changes and how that's damaging to what Johnson can do. In April of 1966, Lyndon Johnson proposes the third leg of his civil rights agenda, a fair housing bill that will end discrimination in the sale or rental of all housing. He believed this was going to be a top issue for dealing with racial segregation in the North. Civil rights activists were also putting attention on these issues. Martin Luther King moves to Chicago, and he rents an apartment in the slums where he's going to live simply to bring attention to these kinds of issues. When Johnson sends the bill to Congress, there is a fierce backlash. Not only do conservatives oppose it, but many Northern Democrats from pretty liberal districts also say their constituents are not happy with this. They're scared about what it will do to property value. They don't want to live in integrated neighborhoods. And there's a big backlash on Capitol Hill in the summer of 1966 when many members are thinking about re-election. And it really has a big effect on some campaigns. In Illinois, Senator Paul Douglas, who's one of the liberal icons of the time, who had been a chief supporter of civil rights, is facing opposition from a businessman named Charles Percy, who was so good-looking, one reporter said it looked like someone had cast him to play the role of the senator. And he's running, and even though he's pretty moderate on civil rights, he's using Johnson's bill as a way to build support in some pretty liberal districts and constituencies in Chicago. Douglas, at one point, gets a call from Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson says, "Do you want me to come out to Illinois to help you, to campaign for you?" And it's an amazing conversation. Douglas says, "The feelings about this bill are pretty bad. I think for both of us, it would be better if you didn't come, because it's not going to help me, and frankly, it's probably not going to help you either." The bill dies in 1966, and the midterms don't go well for the Democrats. Republicans campaign on a series of issues, the housing bill. They also talk about Vietnam, not from the perspective that we needed to pull out, but that Johnson wasn't fighting hard enough. And finally, the deficits and inflation were becoming a threat. Republicans gained 47 seats in the House. They increased their numbers more slightly in the Senate, but that conservative coalition is back after 1966. In 1967, Johnson again pushes for this housing bill, but it doesn't go anywhere. The supporters even water it down. They only say some of America's housing stock will be covered. They weaken the enforcement provisions, but still Johnson is unable to move the bill. Much of his time in 1967 is not devoted to domestic policy, but rather it's focused on Vietnam. And one of the issues the conservatives in Congress care about are the costs of Vietnam. And when Wilbur Mills asked, and when Lyndon Johnson asked Congress in 1967 to increase taxes, to pass a surcharge that will help pay for Vietnam and the Great Society, and which will help fight inflation, Wilbur Mills, reinvigorated after 1966, says no. He says, you'll only get more money if you cut domestic spending. You'll only get money for Vietnam if you cut the Great Society. You'll only get money for guns if we take away some of the butter. And this is really the fight over Vietnam on the domestic front that consumes Johnson in 67. In 1968, the housing bill finally passes, but it passes because of Martin Luther King's assassination. Following the assassination, there are new rounds of riots that take place in several cities, including the District of Columbia, and many members of the House feel that if they don't pass something, the civil unrest will greatly expand. And the final bill that passes in 1968, the housing bill, is a pale version of what Johnson proposed 2 years earlier. It has no enforcement mechanism at all, and it only covers a small part of the nation's housing stock. Frustrated, whenever someone approached him to ask why he couldn't do more, Johnson constantly tried to explain, look at what's going on in American politics on Capitol Hill. I can't do much more. When the Kerner Commission, a commission set up in response to the riots of 1967, is thinking of proposing more government spending on the cities, Johnson is furious. Not that he's against the spending programs they want, but he says politically, this is never going to work. He tells Mayor Daley in a phone conversation, they're going to ask me to do something which politically I have no capacity to do, and it will just be seen as an embarrassment to my presidency. When one legislator, a senator, calls him up and says, "Mr. President," this is in 1967, "can't you do more? Can't you do more to get a domestic bill that they were trying to move? After all," he said, "you're the master of the Senate. Can't you make this happen?" Johnson, you could hear the anger, even though it's over the phone, says, "Master of the Senate? I'm not the master of one damn thing. We can't make this Congress do one damn thing that it doesn't want to do." So this is the story of the book. It doesn't at all intend to diminish Lyndon Johnson as a president, but really to understand what kind of environments allow someone with his skill to govern, especially with an eye on what Congress was like in that period and why a broken Congress suddenly is able to produce a lot of legislation. I'm really interested in how do we get into a period where Congress changes dramatically and how certain presidents understand the limits of presidential power and use that to their advantage. It is a story about how social movements can have a huge effect on Washington, D.C., and how organized congressional coalitions can give presidents the support they need when these windows open. It's a narrative history filled with great personalities like Dirksen or like Martin Luther King or like Lyndon Johnson himself that's meant simply to understand this tumultuous and pretty remarkable decade in American history. But I also hope that the book at some level is instructive today as we deal with a similarly bleak environment where many Americans feel that Washington is hopelessly trapped in an era of gridlock. Thank you.
Of course, we have time for questions, and if you wouldn't mind, we have microphones on either side. Please wait for the mic to ensure that we can get your words recorded and everyone can hear. Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. As you can see, I wore Princeton's colors in honor of your attendance. My name is Sandy Thatcher, class of 1965 at Princeton, and I want to ask you a question about the role of the politicization of youth in that era with respect to the election of 1964 and more generally, and how that impacted the period that you talked about. And I want to do it by telling you a little story about Princeton. My class was a transitional class. In 1963, Princeton experienced, after House Parties weekend in May, the largest non-political riot on the Princeton campus involving 1,500 undergraduates, about half of the entire class, which rampaged around town with no particular reason, pulled panty raids on Miss Fine's school for finishing school for girls, picked up cars with their occupants, put them on the sidewalk, and so forth. This made the front page of the New York Times, which, of course, accused Princetonians of hooliganism and irresponsibility. The president of Princeton at the time, Robert Goheen, wrote a letter to all of the undergraduates telling them how irresponsible he thought they were, and he was really miffed because right at the same time, there were important civil rights things going on down in the South. So he contrasted Princeton undergraduate behavior with the responsible political behavior of other actors on the scene at that time. But what I want to suggest is that by 1964, many of my classmates were going south to participate in the civil rights movement. Many were supporting the Berkeley free speech movement. By the time we graduated, I would suggest that my classmates had become very politicized. One of my classmates, Bill Bradley, who led our basketball team to the NCAA Final Four, I might remind people, went on to become a liberal senator from New Jersey and then ran for president a few elections ago, as you might recall. And I think that a lot of my class really became strong supporters of the kinds of things that President Johnson wanted to have happen. So now that a small part of the voting population, but I would suggest that attitudes changed among youth in pretty dramatic ways, probably influenced the general population. But also, just as a footnote, You can see how far we come when, having produced Liberal Senator Bill Bradley then, we produced Senator Ted Cruz for the current election.
So, thank you. It is obviously today we're in a period where there's a lot of talk about youth engagement in politics. It is pretty remarkable to recover in the 1960s the way in which young Americans were becoming involved, not simply through voting, but really through becoming part of the various movements on different issues of that decade and playing a pretty important role. And it's on the right and the left. I'll add that part of what a lot of historians have been looking at are conservative young Americans on college campuses in the 1960s were also becoming very engaged. And you could see the kind of seeds of the conservative movement of the 1970s and 80s start in this same decade. But I think the kind of transformation you're talking about as the scale and scope of the movement broadens and starts to draw in more students from campus protest or campus activism to going out in the field, so to speak, and then returning later in the decade for the anti-war movement is extremely important. And these movements really were shaping the political debate in pretty profound ways. So I think you're right, and I would just expand the range of young political activism that we see at that time. I don't think, you can talk about whether that exists today. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's the scale and scope that you saw in the 1960s.
Okay. My question is regarding the relationship between Lyndon Johnson and the Democratic Party.
Yes.
He did two things that seem to harm the Democratic Party. One is pushing through the civil rights bills, which caused the South to traditionally voted Democratic to be lost to the Republicans until today. And another thing he did was he surprisingly just publicly announced on TV that he would not run for a third term, which would give the next 80 years to Republicans. And so I just wonder about your thoughts on that. And if I may, I'd like to ask a second question too. In my opinion, he was the most important politician to push through the civil rights bills. But somehow the people who are really into civil rights movement, they don't seem to praise him so much. For example, the Democratic candidate front runner right now, she said something about the significance of Lyndon B. Johnson, I think a year ago, and she got immediately pushed back.
So so the first part, the civil right, the famous story of the Civil Rights Act is when the night that the bill is signed, Bill Moyers finds Johnson sitting looking forlorn and depressed, and he can't understand why Johnson looks this way when he has just pushed through this huge legislative victory. And Johnson says that basically they've just handed Republicans the South for a generation to come. And there is, let me just say, there's an element of Johnson which I find fascinating, where he's willing to make these sacrifices or take these huge political risks for policy that he thought was very significant at the time. Most of the policies had clear political risks. Even education. It was this bill that divided Catholic Democrats and Protestant Democrats in pretty fierce ways that we forget. And moving forward with that was not necessarily politically smart. So we think of Johnson as master calculator. Oh, he's kind of thinking of the next election, and you'll see that in the play a little bit. But there is this other element where he doesn't always think that way. I would say the South doesn't go Republican for a while. I mean, it will take a long time. And so now kind of it's unclear whether, it's Johnson's fault with that bill or a series of issues that will unfold over the decade and party building in the southern states by people like George H.W. Bush is equally significant and was moving politics in the region in that direction without the civil rights bill. But I do think it had that effect, and it's very revealing about the kind of politician that he was. And it wasn't just who he was. this is where the politics had reached at that moment. The Democratic Party really didn't have much of a choice anymore. So that tension was going to happen. His resignation is another classic moment. You know, Johnson had been telling people I might resign for many years already. He had even drafted a fake resignation, or not fake, but he had drafted one to include in a speech and took it back. And some people felt, you know, he was kind of struggling with what to do. And so people always like to ask, would Johnson have beat Nixon in 1968? And kind of implicit in the question is, did this really change the direction of politics because of the resignation? In his mind, he was saving both the country and saving the party and his presidency. The idea was, if he took himself out of this political quagmire that he was in with Vietnam, he might be able to actually resolve Vietnam, which would be the one thing at that point that could restore faith in his presidency and in his party. He also wants to resolve things like this budget battle. He thinks as a running candidate, it will never happen. It didn't work out that way, but that was part of what he was thinking. But it obviously opens the door to Nixon. And the second question, now I'm forgetting the second part. Tell me, oh, Hillary Clinton. So this comes up. It's kind of become this symbol. Where are you on Lyndon Johnson? It came up twice in terms of the civil rights. The first time was in 2008. Hillary Clinton made a comment about that I don't remember the exact comments. Basically, you need a president with the skills of a Lyndon Johnson to help get something like a civil rights bill through. A lot of President Obama's supporters didn't like that comment. They thought it undercut the role of the civil rights movement, and it became a way to understand two different kinds of politicians. It was very interesting where you stood on Johnson. It became very contentious. And then it happened again with the movie Selma, where, you know, same kind of argument happened, as well as the treatment of Johnson as being opposed to voting rights became a subject of contention. And so, you know, understanding Lyndon Johnson for many people is now a way to talk about this relationship between movements and leaders. I'm a historian, so endlessly messy. You know, I see both, and that's what I try to convey in the book. If you look at one without the other, and this other force called Congress, you don't really understand how they combine at a given year, in a given year, to produce this. Johnson's leadership was essential. I do believe, and I've been asked this, did he support civil rights? Did he support voting rights? I have no question that he did. And he was a very forceful and very committed and believed those bills had to go through. I mean, I think it was genuine. He understood the political risks involved. He couldn't have done it without the movement. The movement shaped him. I mean, part of how he got to that place was watching the movement, was listening to the movement. His relationship with Martin Luther King is really interesting. It's a key part of my book. And the movie Selma presents it as adversarial in many ways. It's about the tensions between them and the FBI wiretapping and threatening. But I think there's a different relationship where King was a really shrewd legislative political tactician who was always trying to bridge what the movement was doing on the streets to what was happening in Congress and the White House. And Johnson understood this and depended on King to do some of this work. So one last thing on this. In the voting rights, part of what happens is the tension over voting rights in January and February of 1965 is, should Johnson put that bill in front of Congress then or wait for many months? Johnson's inclination is to wait, because he is totally in favor of a voting rights bill. In fact, he has it drafted in 1964. Nick Katzenbach, who becomes Attorney General, the head of the Justice Department, he drafts it. And the administration and Everett Dirksen actually make a deal by February of 1965 over a voting rights bill. But Johnson doesn't want to formally propose it because he's scared that Southerners will have a backlash. This coalition that he has for other things like Medicare will fall apart. It will almost overload the system to deal with two race-related bills within a couple of months. But the civil rights movement has no interest in that kind of thinking, because often delay was a way that legislation never happened. So the protest in Selma in March are very important. But what they really do is force the president to finally make his famous speech and send the bill to Congress earlier on. But the relationship was not oppositional. In some ways, King provided him the mood that he needed, the public mood, the legislative mood, to move forward on it earlier than he thought was possible. Should I remind me randomly?
Yeah. My name's Jarman Downs. How you doing, Professor?
Oh, there you are. Okay.
We really enjoyed tonight. Something that's always plagued me, of all the history pieces I've read on Johnson or documentaries I've seen, it's always plagued me for the Civil Rights Bill. Was Johnson trying to protect his legacy? Was he compassionate about the bill? Or do you feel like, in your mind, that the country was leading him to be such a provider and a pusher for civil rights?
Well, I think he, in the 1950s, for example, he was not a strong proponent of civil rights legislation. Part of it was political. He saw the power the Southerners had when he was majority leader and understood that the odds of getting a very strong bill were slim. A bill gets through in 1957. This is what Robert Caro writes about. But most liberals at the time saw it as an inconsequential bill. In fact, it was worse than something strong. It was worse than nothing because it gave the appearance of civil rights without actually providing civil rights or guaranteeing civil rights. I do think, though, Johnson was sympathetic to the movement. I think pretty early on, look, in the 1930s when he heads the National Youth Administration here in Texas, he's very conscious of getting federal funds to African Americans informally and secretly, working with African American leaders in the state to make sure that money goes their way. By the 1950s, he's certainly sympathetic toward the idea of racial justice. It's often a disconnect with the way he speaks. There's a total disconnect, but that doesn't mean he wasn't in favor of the agenda. By the early 1960s, I think it's a combination. Like many politicians, the movement moved him. The movement was powerful all the way up to the White House, and so it did have an effect on him. But by 1963 and 64, he is firmly committed to a civil rights bill. It's not simply a political legacy-building issue, although he understands how important this will be to how people remember him. I think he's committed to ending segregation. And again, it's a politically risky thing that he is engaging in. And with the Voting Rights Act, similarly, although now we don't think of it that way, it was at the time. But so that's my take on him. I do think he had kind of he was aligned with the forces of the movement. Okay. Does anyone have over there? Yeah.
And if Johnson were president now, in the same cast of characters, could he have done the horse trading? Could he have done the facilitating? Could he have done the intimidation and gotten these things through with the rules as they exist today as opposed to the
Yeah, I think the answer is I think it would be pretty difficult for him. So, there's A, the rules, B, the culture of Congress, and C, this question of where social movements and organizations are. The rules have changed, and so now the rules facilitate very strong, disciplined partisanship on the Hill. And it ranges from the way in which committees have diminished in terms of their authority compared to the party leaders to the campaign finance mechanisms that party leaders have to make sure that everyone in the party stays in line. And so the kind of intra-party divisions that existed in the 60s, which were really important to getting a lot of these bills through, they don't exist anymore. And so it's just, as we see with the Supreme Court issue so far, it's very hard to get movement. And that, that's an extreme issue. So we see how this works on the budget and things. So the rules don't favor strong divided government dynamics anymore. Second, the culture is, you could argue, different. Again, I don't want to be nostalgic because in 1963, Congress was a tough place too. So it's different kinds of tough right now. But clearly, the new generation of members, I could say, one difference is they're not as invested in legislating. I mean, what's remarkable about the 60s generation is with all the problems that existed and with all the gridlock that existed, these were lifetime members, and they were members at some level who valued what they were doing. I don't mean this as to dismiss current legislators. I don't think that's how they conceive of their job anymore. So that makes it hard for a forceful president to get a lot done. And finally, going back to the book and comparing it today, there was immense social and organizational pressure on Congress to get all these bills through, from African American leaders to organize. The AFL-CIO was a huge presence in Washington for liberals during this decade. They could mobilize votes. They could pressure members of Congress in both parties. And that was absolutely essential. You had liberal organizations like the Americans for Democratic Action and these kind of Washington-based groups which were constantly pushing on these bills. And I think that's essential for why Johnson succeeded. I do think liberal Democratic presidents today don't have that world anymore. And so they're much more isolated against an intransigent Congress. It's not going to work. And so if you just throw Lyndon Johnson in that environment, I think it would be incredibly hard. That's why I don't like the comparisons all the time. Why isn't Obama doing more arm twisting? Because all the rules, the culture, and that social, political, organizational environment is just very, very different. And we can't just focus on the president because then we forever find ourselves frustrated. We have to understand, how do you create a process, a system, an environment where legislating is going to be happening.
This just may be a footnote to history, but when I was at my 50th reunion at UT this past fall, I learned that there was a young woman who used to, African-American woman, who used to march along with others in front of Kinsolving Dormitory, which was an air-conditioned dormitory for women. And it turns out that Linda Bird had just moved in there in January of '64. And this young woman picked up the phone and called the White House and said, does the president know that his daughter lives in a segregated dormitory? The President Johnson, picks up the phone and calls the chairman of the Board of Regents and said, change it. The very next day, she moved in. By the way, this woman then went on to go to medical school, and she's now in practice with her niece in LA and also is a professor at, I think, UCLA. So anyway, just a footnote.
Yeah, amazing story.
Actually, I'm gonna take the prerogative of asking the final question because no one has yet put you properly on the spot, and that is, as a historian, I want you to answer this question as a historian, not as a political observer, not as a partisan player in any way, but as a historian. How do you view the current issue over the Supreme Court nomination?
I mean, part of it is it's a gradual accumulation of the nature of the confirmation process. I mean, it's a buildup that's been going on since the 1960s, where the nomination process has become increasingly politicized. And you could point to different marks. You could start with Abe Fortas. You could talk about Robert Bork. You could kind of pick whichever moments you want. But we've seen, how the process itself changes, where the kind of politics of both the nominator and the nominee plays an important role in how the confirmation can go, the kinds of questions and the kinds of issues that are legitimate change. Then we've now seen just many more pretty partisan votes over nominees, not just at the Supreme Court, but at the federal level over the last decade and a half. Then you've seen in the last few years, kind of the third stage, just not putting judges up so the kind of obstruction of the confirmation process has become something pretty familiar to people involved with this, and now it's reached the Supreme Court. And it is extreme. I mean, I do think it's hard. politically, I don't understand it. To be honest, I would think if I was a Republican advisor, I would say, hold your hearings, have your discussions, and vote no, because that's been the strategy. So this is kind of taking it, if they continue, we'll see what happens, that they won't even kind of consider the nominee, not even meet with the nominee. I do think that is an acceleration of the process. But it comes out of several decades now where this process has been breaking down. So you could almost see this being the point that we would reach, where the opposition party will say, we're not even going to confirm. You just have a shrinking court all of a sudden.
Well, that's an optimistic way to end it. If you'll all join me in thanking you.
Thanks. Thank you.